This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. What if comparing car insurance rates was as easy as putting on your favorite podcast? With Progressive, it is. Just visit the Progressive website to quote with all the coverages you want. You'll see Progressive's direct rate, then their tool will provide options from other companies so you can compare. All you need to do is choose the rate and coverage you like. Quote today at Progressive.com to join the over 28 million drivers who trust Progressive. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Comparison rates not available in all states or situations. Prices vary based on how you buy.
Hello, friends. You're listening to No Small Endeavor. This is our unabridged interview with David Brooks on his new New York Times best-selling book, How to Know a Person. I've had the opportunity to be with David on a number of occasions, and I always find it to be a pleasure. I do get to meet a lot of fascinating people, and occasionally I get to meet some relatively famous people. But my wife, she's never impressed with the relatively famous people I get to meet. But she has been, I think, on 2 occasions. And one of those was when I first met David Brooks. He is a person who is, in his role as an op-ed writer for the New York Times, is alternately loved or despised by many, many people, given his status there as a New York Times op-ed writer. And given that fact, I especially respected the ways in which he made himself vulnerable in the book and in this interview. And in the interview, even talking about a recent fiasco that had become a significant embarrassment to him, which you'll hear him discuss. The book is moving and beautiful at various points, especially in some of the reflections he gives on friendship. And it's also a highly practical book in taking the approach that there are certain skills that are in short supply these days in how we might relate to one another. And he spends a great deal of time trying to teach us some skills for how we might relate to other people better, how we might understand and know other people better. So very moving and very practical. I hope you enjoy this interview with David Brooks. Just a warning that this episode contains mention of suicide. David Brooks is a Canadian-born American journalist. He's been op-ed columnist for the New York Times since 2003, has been a regular guest on PBS NewsHour since 2004. David grew up in New York City, completing his undergrad at the University of Chicago in history. He's also the author of numerous books, including #1 New York Times bestsellers, The Road to Character and The Second Mountain. Today we're discussing his latest New York Times bestseller, How to Know a Person, The Art of Seeing Others Deeply and Being Deeply Seen. David Brooks, it's great to see you again.
No, it's good to be with you, Lee. It's a pleasure always to be in your company.
Yeah, thanks for coming to be with us. So here you are, a successful New York Times op-ed writer, and here this book on knowing people. Why do you care about this? And in the midst of a world of so much political turmoil that you could pontificate about, you're talking about personal relationships. What's driven you to this?
There's a personal reason for this and a social reason. The personal reason is we're all trying to grow and become slightly better human beings. And my personal journey is that I was a guy who was probably pretty good at writing, but probably not too emotionally available for the people around me. And so I've been on a journey over the last 15 years to try to become a better human. And part of that is become more emotionally available. Part of that is become more spiritually mature. And part of that is just treat people with more consideration and kindness and justice. And so that's the personal journey. The social journey is that we live in a time that's weirdly dehumanizing. And you know the statistics as well as I do that the number of people committing suicide is up by 1/3. Mental health problems are skyrocketing. The number of Americans who say they have no close personal friends has gone up 4 times since 2000. The high school students, 45%, say they're persistently hopeless and despondent. And so we're in the middle of some sort of social crisis. And the answer to my personal problem of trying to be more relatable, try to be more intimate, try to be a better friend to people, and the answer to our social problem, which is low trust and high hostility and brutal politics, is the same. Just being better at and more considerate at treating each other with kindness, respect, and understanding. And so I just thought the one skill that's at the center of any family, church, organization, company, or society is the ability to see others deeply and be deeply seen. I want to get better at that. So I wrote a book trying to teach myself to go better. And hopefully other people around the country will want to get better and will read the book and will treat other people with more kindness.
Yeah. You're fairly personal, and you say things about yourself like, when it came to spontaneous displays of emotion, I had the emotional capacity of a head of cabbage. Unpack some of that for us and tell us kind of what some of the growth has looked like for you, perhaps in some more specifics.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up in a home that was, we had love in the home. We didn't express it. So we were not like one of these huggy homes. We were not a home where people said, I love you. And so I grew up in an intellectual world, and we around the Thanksgiving Day dinner table, we talked about the evolutionary history of lactose intolerance, the history of Victorian funerary monuments. So we were super cerebral, intellectual, and I grew up in that home. But I wasn't great at relating to people. And so that episode you described sort of summarizes a way of life I had, which was like, I'm 50 years old. I love baseball. I go to a lot of baseball games. And so I'm at a ball game with my son in Baltimore. And in all those games, I'd never caught a foul ball. And I'm with my son in Baltimore, my youngest son, and a batter loses control of a bat. It flies through the air, lands in the stands, and lands on my lap. So I get a bat. Now, getting a bat at a baseball game is 1,000 times better than getting a ball. And so any normal human being is waving the bat in the air, is celebrating, high-fiving everybody around, hugging people, getting onto the Jumbotron. I just put on the bat on the ground and sat staring straight ahead. So I had like the emotional reaction of a head of cabbage or a turtle. Like I had no reaction. And I look back on that guy and I say, show a little joy, man. And so I thought I would better embark on a personal journey to be a little more emotionally open and a little more emotionally available. And so I spent 10 years, like I wanted to learn about emotion. So being a good University of Chicago graduate, I wrote a book about emotion called The Social Animal. And then I wrote a book about character called The Road to Character. And I learned writing that book that you don't actually get good character from writing a book about character. And you don't even get good character from reading a book about character. But my joke is if you buy a book about character, you get a lot of good character. So I advise everybody to buy my book. And then I wrote a book about called The Second Mountain, which is a little about my spiritual journey from a very secular world to a more religious set of beliefs. And then this book is about how to connect with people on the most fundamental level. And it's meant to be very practical. It's like when you meet somebody, as you try to befriend them, as you sit with them as they're suffering from depression, as you sit with them as they're disagreeing with you politically, what are the exact skills you need to get to know someone and to establish intimate connection?
Yeah.
And through all these books, I'm basically trying to teach myself. We writers, my favorite thing about writing is we writers are beggars who tell other beggars where we found bread. And so if I learn something valuable, I throw it into a book in the hopes that other people will find it valuable. And that's my big reward, when other people find something valuable that I found valuable.
Yeah, that's helpful. Yeah, I want to dig into quite a bit about some of the specifics, because I do find your book very practical and deeply helpful. But before we go there, when you think back about that person who was more reserved, if you think about the person catching that baseball bat, do you think that the lack of emotion or the lack of joy that was shown, was it related to fear, or was it related to a lack of basic skill, or how would you frame that?
Yeah, all of the above. So like those of us who are not good at making connection, understanding others, I think there's a fundamental level of egotism. We're thinking about ourselves. We're not thinking about others. Second, we don't think we possess the skills. So if somebody comes to me in my old life, say 15 years ago, if you came to me with a personal problem and you were trying to deal with something in your personal life, I would panic. I just didn't know what to say. And so I was not a good friend to people who were going through something hard, because I would flee from that kind of emotional encounter. And so that was just lack of skills. And so there's like the normal fear of emotion. There's the fear of intimacy. One of my heroes in this journey has been Friedrich Buechner, who I hope some of your listeners know. Great novelist. He lost his father to suicide when Buechner was 9. And he never really mourned him. His mom took them to Bermuda. They just ran. They ran away. And so Buechner's in middle age. He's never mourned his dad. And so he had covered over all the emotions that he had experienced. And nothing like as terrible as that ever happened to me, thank God. But I had still covered over things because I was busy on my career. I was busy writing. I was busy working. And so to be emotionally available was not a priority. And then I think, at a certain point, you think, I want to be better at connecting with people. I want to be the kind of person people would come to if they're working through a problem they want somebody to talk to. Mm-hmm. And so I hope in the last 10 years I've grown a little to become more of that kind of person. I had a bit of a spiritual awakening about 10 years ago. And that, I think, opened myself up to the deeper chasms within my own soul that I wanted to fill with spiritual and relational food. And so I've been on this little journey. And it's been a challenge, and it's been, I'm still very imperfect. But I think progress can be made even in middle age. That some people tell you can't change after age 30. I think that's ridiculous.
Yeah.
That I know a lot of people have changed a lot after age 30, and I've changed a lot after age 50. And so I'm about to name drop here, but I've been interviewed twice in my life by Oprah. And after the second interview, it was 2019, Oprah pulls me aside and says, David, I've rarely seen anybody change so much in middle age. You were so emotionally blocked before. And so that was a good day for me. Like, she's Oprah. She should know. She's the expert. And she said, you've become more emotionally open. And that's the goal of somebody in middle age, to become open to your friends, to your colleagues, to your kids, and to be like, just show up for them.
Yeah.
And that was weirdly, and this is what this book is about. It's like being open-hearted. That's part of it. But part of it is just skills. It's knowing how to sit with somebody who's depressed, knowing how to disagree with somebody well, knowing how to host somebody who's at a dinner party and make everybody feel included. Those are just basic skills, and they can be learned just as much as carpentry or sailing or anything else.
Yeah. I'll definitely reiterate. I'll definitely echo agreement on. I think I changed fundamentally in very important ways in my mid to late 30s, and then again in my mid to late 40s. And so, if you can't make significant change after 30, I'd be toast. And so I'm thankful that I think we can.
Do you have incidents that caused the changes, or was it a decision?
I did. Yeah, I had several. My early to mid 30s, I had a sort of fundamental things about my life that just were not going to work long term, that forced me to do a lot of therapy and other kind of work. And then later, kind of classic midlife stuff and depression in my mid to late 40s that was very difficult to process and required me to learn another set of skills and required me to learn what I had to let go of, and the classic serenity prayer kind of stuff, learning what we can control and what we can't control, and again another large set of skills that went with that. So let's move then to talking about some of the skills. So your part one, you developed this in three parts, and part one is I see you, and then you turn to this fundamental practice of giving attention to the other, and you say at one point in talking about the power of questioning in giving attention to others, you say, quote, I've come to think of questioning as a moral practice. So unpack that for us.
Yeah, when you're asking, first, I found that sometimes I go to a party and I leave the party, and I think that whole time nobody asked me a question. Like, they were like selling themselves, they were portraying themselves, but they were just not curious about me. And I've come to believe that only about 30 or 40% of human beings are question askers, that they're genuinely curious about the other people around them. The other people are perfectly nice, but they're just not question askers. They're just like performing themselves. Like, here's what I want you to think of me. And so I thought, well, I want to be a good questioner. And so how do you become that? And again, it's a skill. And so in the book, I talk about a woman named Niobe Way, who was teaching young students, 7th grade boys in New York City, how to be question askers, how to be really good at it. And I think she learned you don't have to be good at teaching kids how to ask questions. Kids are great at asking questions. And so in Naomi's case, she said, okay, you're seventh graders. I'm going to teach you. I'm going to sit in the front of the class and ask me anything and I'll answer it honestly. And so the first boy said, are you married? And she said, no. And the second boy said, are you divorced? And she said, yes. And the third boy said, do you still love him?
Oh, wow.
And she was like, whoa, what's going on here? And she said, yes, with tears in her eyes. And the fourth boy said, does he know you still love him?
Wow.
And the fifth boy said, do your kids know you still love him? And so like they're kids, they know how to ask questions. They go right for it.
Yeah.
But I think as we get older, a lot of us get a little more timid and shy about asking questions. And in my view, we get overly timid and shy. You don't want to rush into these things. Like when I'm first meeting someone, there are certain questions I'll ask just to get us going. That's like questions like, where'd you grow up? I travel a lot, so I've probably been where they've grown up. Or how'd you get your name? People talk about their family, their ethnicity. How'd you get your name? And then as I get to know people a little better, I'll ask a little more personal, but not too personal. And so I asked a theologian friend of mine, what's your favorite unimportant thing about you? And he told me that he's a big theologian. I thought very intimidating, but he loves a lot of reality, trashy TV. And so I learned that about him. And I said, well, my favorite unimportant thing about me is I like early Taylor Swift more than I like later Taylor Swift. So there's something about those high school breakup songs that she used to sing that I really like. And so that's unimportant, but it's something about me. And if you ask those kinds of questions, then later on you can ask the more serious questions.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. I want to make sure I remember that one. What's the most important thing about you? Or what is an
favorite unimportant thing about you?
Favorite unimportant thing about you. Yes, that's quite helpful. In the vein of this, you talk about how you're kind of arguing for a different model of ethics. And later in the book, you talk about John Stuart Mill. And of course, there are plenty of the Enlightenment thinkers that kind of focus on moral rules or principles when they're talking about ethics. And you instead are making the case, working out of Iris Murdoch, that seeing how we see people and an attempt to see people well ought to be seen as a fundamental part of our moral endeavors, which I think is super helpful. But talk about that a bit.
Yeah, so all these male philosophers like John Stuart Mill or Immanuel Kant, they built these vast moral systems. And they're based on abstractions, the rules. And Kant, it should never treat somebody as an ends, never treat somebody as a means, treat them as an ends. Like, don't use someone to get someone else. Like, That's a pretty good rule. But it's pretty abstract. And it's pretty, philosophical, academic. But along comes somebody like Iris Murdoch, who's a woman, and who's learning from another woman named Simone Weil, that the essential moral act is the act of attention. It's not like some fancy moral rule. It's like you're sitting in a coffee shop, you're sitting in a restaurant, you got your kid right in front of you. What kind of attention are you casting upon that person? And it's possible to cast a cold and aloof attention, in which case you're a cold and aloof person. If you cast the kind of attention which is looking for danger and threat, then you're going to find menace. But Iris Murdoch said our goal should be to cast a just and loving attention on others. So we see someone, we're going to see with the eyes of love. We're going to see with the eyes of compassion. And if we see with those eyes, we're going to call forth a different version of the person, a version that's more loving, more warm, more personal. And so the story I tell in the book is I'm in Waco, Texas, it's probably 3 or 4 years ago. And I'm having breakfast with a 93-year-old lady named LaRue Dorsey. And LaRue Dorsey presents herself to me as a strict disciplinarian. She'd been a teacher much of her life, and she said, I loved my students enough to discipline them. And I was a little intimidated by this formidable lady. And into the diner walks a mutual friend of ours, a guy named Jimmy Durrell. And Jimmy pastors to the homeless in Waco. And he comes up to our table. He knows us both. And he grabs Mrs. Dorsey by the shoulders. And he shakes her way harder than you should shake a 93-year-old. And he says to her, Mrs. Dorsey, Mrs. Dorsey, you're the best. You're the best. I love you. I love you. And suddenly that stern disciplinarian that I've been talking to turns into a bright, eye-shining 9-year-old girl.
Huh.
And that's the power of attention. If you shine a certain kind of warm attention on somebody, you will bring forth a different version of that person. Mm-hmm. And it's not only his own warmth, it's something philosophical, really. But Jimmy's a pastor. He pastors to the homeless in Waco. When Jimmy sees someone, any human being he meets, he sees someone made in the image of God. Mm. He's looking into the soul of someone of infinite value and dignity. He's looking at somebody so important that Jesus was willing to die for that person. Now, you could be Christian or Jewish or Muslim or atheist or agnostic. Don't really care. But looking at every person you meet with that level of reverence and respect is a precondition for seeing them well. Mm. If you see each person as a mystery that you'll never get to the bottom of, as someone of infinite value, then you're going to be curious about the person. You want to ask questions. You're going to see who they are in their fullness. And you'll that's the beginning of seeing them well. So to me, that's the moral quality of attention. It's just a super powerful moral act. The way you pay attention to the people becomes who you are in the world.
Yeah.
There's a phrase from Parker Palmer, a great educator. Every epistemology implies an ethic. Every way of knowing in the world becomes a way of showing up in the world. And so Jimmy had a beautiful way of showing up in the world.
Mm. You have a beautiful passage from David White who says, friendship, quote, is not improvement, neither of the other nor of the self, but the ultimate touchstone is witness, the privilege of having been seen by someone and the equal privilege of being granted the sight of the essence of another, to have walked with them and to have believed in them. That's such a beautiful portrait of friendship.
Yeah, the thing I love about the quotation is that we're not trying to improve each other. We're just trying to witness each other. We're just trying to be along for the ride.
Yeah.
And friendship is that, the privilege, I like the phrase, the privilege of having been seen. It really is a privilege to, when somebody really knows you well, and it's a privilege to give them that. I wrote a book, we're in 2023, I wrote a book in 2000, and it was my first book, and it got reviewed a bunch of places, and one of the reviews was, I can't remember where it was, but it was written by a woman named Diana Schaub, who I sort of knew but didn't really know. And she teaches at Johns Hopkins. And she got me. She understood why I was trying to write the book. She had some criticisms of it. It wasn't totally a positive review, but she understood my intention. And to feel so well seen that somebody gets what you're trying to do.
Yeah.
I remember that 23 years later. And so even for this book, the last 4 years, I've been calling around asking people, tell me about a time you felt seen. And people would tell me stories with glowing eyes that seemed kind of mundane. Like one woman told me, she was about 40. And she told me, when I was 13, I had my first taste of alcohol. And I got so drunk when my friends dropped me off at my house on the front porch. I lay down on the porch, I couldn't get up. And my father, who was a tough guy, came out, and I thought he was going to scream at me all the things that were going on in my head. I'm bad, I'm bad, I'm bad. Instead, he just picked me up in his arms, carried me inside, laid me down on the sofa, and said, there'll be no punishment here. You've had an experience. That's it. You've had an experience. And so she remembers that moment like 30 years later, that her dad understood he didn't need to scream at her at that moment. And so she felt seen. And it's not super remarkable. It's like an everyday thing a parent might do. But it's an example of somebody saying, okay, I know you don't need to be screamed at right now. I'm just going to be on your team. And I'm just going to support you. I'm just going to be here with you. And it's like, it has an effect on people.
Yeah. You have one, I think it's a full chapter, where you define a person. It's kind of perhaps to some a provocative definition of a person as a point of view. And you're making the case that if we really want to see another person, then we need to at least make an attempt to try to see that person's point of view. But to talk to us a bit more about that and how you came to see that yourself.
Yeah, when I was working on this book, I taught it at university at Yale. So I'd ask my students, what's a person? Like, if you know a person, you should know what a person is. And nobody had any answers. They'd never been asked this question. And so what is a person? And so to me, the greatest thing all of us do is we take the experience of our lives and the hardships of our lives and the good things in our lives and the wise people in our lives, and we construct our own unique way of seeing the world. And we each see the world very differently. And you and I could be sitting in an auditorium in Nashville or in New York or wherever, looking at a concert. And in some sense, we're looking at the same thing, but we're all having very different experiences of that thing based on our pains, our hurts, our traumas, our joys, our tastes. And so if I'm going to know you, I want to know how you construct your reality. Experience is not what happens to you. It's what you do with what happens to you. So I want to know how you see that, like you and I are looking at the same situation. How do you see it? And it's likely to be very, very, very different. And so, for example, I quote in the book a study done in the 1950s of a football game between Dartmouth and Princeton. And it was a particularly bloody and brutal game. And the researchers and each team's fans thought the other team committed the most penalties. And then a couple of weeks later, they showed a video of the game to each team's fans. And both groups of fans looked at the same video and said, look, this objectively proves that the other team was worse than our team. And it was the same video. And so it just shows how subjective we all are. And so if I want to understand you, I don't want to know what happened to you. I want to know what meaning you made out of what happened to you. What's your subjective viewpoint on the world? And just to get a little into brain science, not too much, when we look at, say we look at a rainbow, you and I speak English, and so we see a 7-banded rainbow. Now, a rainbow has no bands. It's a continuous stream of light. A rainbow has no color. There's no color in the world. There's just sound waves and visual waves and particles. But a Russian, in Russia, they have 2 words for our word blue. They have one word for light blue and another word for dark blue. And so Russians see 8-banded rainbows. They don't see the same rainbow we see. And so if I'm going to understand the Russians' experience of a rainbow, I can't just say, oh, you saw a rainbow. I have to ask them, how did you see it? I have to understand that each of us has a very subjective view of the world depending on our own culture, our own language, our own experiences. And so I have to be really curious and ask you, how does this look to you? How does this look to you? We don't see the world with our eyes. We see with our entire life. And when you get into the brain science, and I won't go into more detail, but when you get into the brain science, it's amazing we see the same world at all, because so much of what we do with our eyes is we're not seeing the world, we're hallucinating a world that we think will be an accurate hallucination of the world. And so life is very subjective, and we have to respect each other's subjectivity.
So what are some practical ways then to try to understand the way another person understands the world or their experience?
Yeah. So the subtitle of the book is The Art of Seeing Others Deeply and Being Deeply Seen. But if it's accurate, it should be The Art of Hearing Others Deeply and Being Deeply Heard. The essential skill is being a conversationalist. How good are you at conversation? And let me first ask people who are listening to this, how good are you at knowing the people you meet? And I can tell you with great accuracy and confidence, you're not as good as you think you are. There's a guy at the University of Texas who studies how accurate are we at understanding what's going on in somebody's mind when we're talking to them. And the answer is we're accurate about 20% of the time.
Oh.
And so we don't know what's going on in the other person's mind. And some people are pretty good. They're 55%. Some people are terrible. They're 0%. They never understand what's going on in somebody else's mind. They're social idiots, but they think they're accurate 100% of the time. So if I'm going to understand what's going on in your mind as I'm talking to you, it's not good enough for me to guess. I have to ask you. I have to ask you questions. I have to be really good at asking you questions and really good at having conversations. And so in the book, I have a bunch of conversational tips. How do you become a great conversationalist? And there are things like treat attention as an on-off switch, not a dimmer. If I'm going to be in conversation with you, my attention will be 100% or 0. It's not going to be 60%. I'm not going to multitask and be looking at my phone. Another one, there's a friend who you may know, a friend of mine named Andy Crouch.
Sure.
And when you talk to Andy, it's like you're talking to a Pentecostal charismatic church. He's like, yes, I agree. That's good. Amen. Preach that. And so what I learned from Andy is be a loud listener. When somebody's talking to you, react. And you can either react verbally like Andy does, or if you go on TV and look at an Oprah interview and turn the sound off, you see her facial expressions are changing depending on what the person is saying. She's a loud listener because she's reflecting back to them all the different emotions they're going. And so that's another tip. Another tip is don't be a topper. If you say to me, I had this terrible flight, I was on the tarmac for 2 hours, I might say, well, I know what you went through. I've been on a flight where we were sat on the tarmac for 4 hours. And it sounds like I'm trying to relate, like we went through the same thing. But really what I'm saying is, A, let's stop talking about you. Let's talk about me. And B, my experience is way better than your experience. And so I'm being a topper. And that's a good way to kill a conversation. So those are some of the practical tips of just how to be a conversationalist.
You've got another real helpful simple acronym, SLANT. Sit up, lean forward, ask questions, nod your head, and track the speaker. And I thought, I think I might start putting that in my course syllabi. That would be a simple, great skill for students in a class, and for all of us.
Students really need it. I mean, one of my tips is treat attention as an on-off switch, not a dimmer. So if you're talking to someone, your attention should be 100% on them or 0% on them, but not 60% on them. And I find a lot of my students, they've never been raised with these skills. They're like, they've lived in the world of screens and all that. And so they just don't have some of the basic skills you need to build good relationships. I saw a study a couple of weeks ago after the book came out on the number of young men who've never asked anybody out on a date. And the number is super high. And they want to know why have these young men gone all through their adolescence and they never asked somebody on a date? And the answer is they stink at flirting. They don't know how to flirt. And they don't know how to ask somebody out. And they certainly don't know how to break up with someone if they ever got into a relationship. And so they're living these lives of isolation. And the answer is they just don't have the skills. And so somehow we've stopped teaching the skills of how to ask somebody on a date. How do you go steady? How do you build a relationship? And if the relationship doesn't work, how do you end it gracefully? How do you end a relationship without breaking somebody's heart? That's a skill. And we don't teach these things anymore.
Yeah. So part 2, you move to I see you in your struggles. And you've already alluded to this earlier in the conversation, the fact that we're in this particularly difficult time with the loneliness epidemic. And you then go on to say things like loneliness leads to meanness and distrust sows distrust, or political movements these days are fueled largely by resentment. So in this kind of apparent breakdown of the social fabric, you're wanting us to lean into seeing one another in our struggles and our difficulties. So kind of point to some of the key ideas that you develop there.
I'll first talk about, one of the chapters in that section is about depression. And so my oldest friend in the world, who's a guy named Pete, we met when we were 11. We played through life. We were friends for life. But when he was 57, he got hit by a period of depression, a very severe depression. And I thought I was reasonably well educated and I should know how to accompany someone who's depressed. But I realized in the course of those years, I didn't even know what depression was. And I learned if you're lucky enough not to have suffered from depression, you can't understand it by extrapolating from your own moments of sadness. That depression, as another friend of mine, Mike Gerson, said, is a malfunction in the instrument we use to perceive reality. So both Pete, my friend, and Mike, another friend, said they had these lying voices in their head, which were screaming at them, you're worthless, you're worthless. Nobody would mind if you disappeared. And those were lies, but the voices were in their heads. And so I learned over the course of 3 years of Pete's illness, a little about how you deal with someone who's suffering from depression. First, I learned the mistakes you make and the mistakes I made. And the first mistake was I tried to give him ideas about how to make the depression lift. So I would say, you used to take these service trips to Vietnam. You found them so rewarding. You should do that. Take some trips and give back, and you'll feel good. And I later learned that if you're giving a depressed person ideas on how to make the depression lift, all you're doing is showing you just don't get it. Because it's not ideas they're lacking. It's lack of energy, it's lack of curiosity, it's lack of a lot of things, but it's not lack of ideas. So I was just showing I was clueless. The second mistake I made was I tried to do what the psychologists call positive reframing, which say, look at all the wonderful things in your life. You have a great career, you have a great wife, great marriage, great kids. And I was just making him feel worse because I was reminding him he was not enjoying the things that are palpably enjoyable. And so I was just not helpful. And I think over the 3 years that we traveled this course together, I learned a few things you should say. The first is just to acknowledge the reality of the situation. This stinks. Tell me about what it's like to be depressed. Just so he doesn't feel so alone in his circumstances. Like I feel, okay, I know what you're going through. I may not share it, but I know I have some idea of what you're going through. The second thing I could have done is a burst of goodwill. And a pastor friend of mine up in DC tell me when he has congregants who are going through hard times, he just says to them, I want more for you. I want more for you. And that expression of goodwill may not solve the problem. It will not solve the problem. But at least you're saying, I'm on your side. I'm on your side. I'm rooting for you. The third thing you can do is constant touches, like a text every day, a phone call, a postcard. It's like no response necessary, but I'm thinking of you. I'm not going away. You may feel isolated, but I'm not going away. I'm going to be here. And then the fourth thing I learned this from Viktor Frankl, who wrote this great book, Man's Search for Meaning, about life in a Nazi death camp. And when he was confronting people who were contemplating suicide, he would say to them, life has not stopped expecting things of you. That there are still responsibilities that you have that you can do good in the world. And one of the things you can do in the world as someone who's suffered a lot of pain is to be a credible voice for others who are suffering pain. And so there's a great quote from Thornton Wilder, in love service, only the wounded soldiers can serve. And you're a wounded soldier, but because of that, your low voice will tremble in the hearts of men and women. And you can do a lot in the world. And all these different things, these 4 different things you can do for somebody who's contemplating suicide or depressed. It may not help in the end. There's a limited power of words, but at least you'll have showed up in the most gracious way possible to show up, and you've sat with somebody who's going through depression, going through thoughts of suicide, and you've been a good friend. And I just say that might not help, but it's at least the best you can do.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say from my own experience that all of those things you described about what does not help and what does help seems quite true to my experience. So I appreciate that a lot.
It was a hard education for 3 years, and my friend Pete lost his battle with suicide, or with depression. But he left a legacy for his friends and family of knowing, let's be honest about this.
Mm-hmm. What was that experience like for you in losing your friend that way?
It was hard. It was hard in first because you felt so powerless. Like the beast that took Pete was like bigger than him, bigger than me, bigger than his wife, bigger than his kids. It was just a big beast. Secondly, I lost 3 close friends within a few months of each other. And some of your listeners may know some of them. One was Pete, they probably wouldn't know, but another was Mike Gerson, who I quoted, who was a Washington Post columnist and a Bush speechwriter. And another was Tim Keller, who was a pastor, a Presbyterian pastor in New York. And so I lost 3 close friends with the rapid succession. And there are a lot of books about how to endure grief from a family member. And people have written books about grief when a spouse dies, when a child dies. But I wasn't prepared for the kind of grief when a friend dies. And so losing a friend, it was sort of uncharted territory to me. And after Pete died, since I knew him since we were 11, the only thing I could compare it to was like going to Montana, which is my favorite state to visit, and suddenly the mountains are gone. It's like he had been a permanent presence in my life, and suddenly that presence was absent. And so I guess the main feature of it was disorientation. I was very disoriented. And the one thing I say to this anybody who's willing to hear, if you're ever in a state of depression, if you're ever in a state of despair, and you think, oh, if I were not here, it would be so much easier on my friends and family, that if I took my own life, I would do them a favor. I can tell you, having lived through the aftermath of Pete's death, that's completely wrong. That you're not doing anybody any favors by taking your life. You're causing a lot of pain. And so if you're ever in a moment of despair thinking it would be easier for everybody if I were not here, that's wrong. You need to stick around.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for that. And in the same vein of seeing others in their suffering and their struggles, and then going back to that notion of understanding another person as a point of view, you as well discussed learning how to ask how the other person was shaped by their sufferings, which I thought's really helpful. And you've got this beautiful line you've already mentioned about Buechner, but this beautiful line from Buechner where he says, "What we hunger for, perhaps more than anything else, is to be known in our full humanness, and yet that is often just what we also fear more than anything else." Talk to us about that a bit.
Yeah, I mean, we want to be known, but we also think if you really know me, you won't like me. And so we built up this fake persona to make other people like us, but it's not really us. And so people who like the fake persona are not really liking us. And, you know, I had mentioned I'd gone through this spiritual journey, and in 2013, I went through hard times. And people used to come up to me in the airport who had seen my writing in the Times or seen my performances on the NewsHour. And some number of people, this is going to sound egotistical, but it's just a fact. They'd say, "Oh, David, we love your work. We really love you." And it would make me sad back in those days, because I think, oh, if you only really actually love me, like you don't really know me. And so that we all put up a front for the world, and we hope it's impressive, we hope it's nice, but it's not really us. And so Buechner says, he has a book called Telling Secrets. And he says, when we're in a relationship, we should tell our secrets to other people from time to time, not all the time. But from time to time, you should tell the secrets of your life. And he says you should do this so you don't lose track of yourself. You don't convince yourself you're the fake persona you create that you think the world will like. Yeah. So tell your secrets so you'll tell your true self. And then he says we should tell secrets from time to time because it'll make it easier for other people to tell their secrets to us. And so that, I think what he learned over the course of a life of at first being invulnerable to be vulnerable and to tell a few secrets and to see if the other people pick up on it and tell you secrets. And then if they do, then you've got a real friendship going.
Yeah. 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 That's the counterintuitive thing about vulnerability is that we tell ourselves that if other people really knew, then they wouldn't love us. But I always qualify this with my students, especially reminding them that prudence is a cardinal virtue, you know, and you can't share your secrets with everybody because everybody can't handle your secrets. But when you have someone who can handle that, who is a relatively mature human being, then that practice of vulnerability actually counterintuitively facilitates vulnerability on the other side. And people really do end up kind of liking us more because they see us as a real human being, it seems.
Yeah. It's a risk to be vulnerable, but I found it's a risk, not always, but sometimes worth taking. And so, for example, you were talking about your students. So I have been teaching college for 25 years. And there was a time, it might have been about 8 years ago. And so I have a seminar and I have 25 kids in it. And the way I would handle the office hours, I was teaching at Yale because I only teach at schools I couldn't have gotten into. So I'm teaching this seminar, and I hold my office hours at a bar between 9 p.m. and 1 a.m. That's just the way I did office hours. And I don't recommend at most universities. And even Yale had a problem with me for doing this. So I'd get 8 kids around. We just talked for long hours. And it was fun. But one night, there was a woman I was courting, and I was trying to get her to marry me. And she said she'd fly up to New Haven to tell me whether or not she would marry me.
Huh.
And so I don't tell my students any of this. That's too personal. But I just say, listen, I'm going to have to cancel office hours tonight. I have to go through something personal. And so that's all I said. It's just personal. I didn't go into any details. And out of the 24, 25 kids in the seminar, I'd say 18 emailed me that night and said, Professor Brooks, I just want you to know I'm thinking of you. I'm praying for you, whatever you're going through. And that whole, that little episode, just a little hint of vulnerability, it changed the tenor of our class the whole term. Because suddenly the students didn't see me as Professor Brooks. They saw me as just another guy trying to get through life. And so we had a much warmer relationship.
Yeah.
And so my lesson for anybody who's teaching and anybody who's managing people in a company, don't spill your guts. Don't open your kimono. But even the smallest hint of intimacy and vulnerability, even the smallest hint, will just show you're a person, and they're going to treat you differently, and you're going to have a better relationship. And Lee, you know the woman who was going to come up to me and tell me, and she came up and she said, her name's Anne, and she said, I could never marry you. It's just not going to work out. And well, now we're 7 years into our marriage, so it all did work out. So she changed her mind.
I was wondering if it was Anne, so I'm glad. I appreciate you finishing the story there, because I was trying to decide, is this an appropriate follow-up question to ask? Because everyone is going to want to know the end of that story.
So no, we had to go through a process before I could persuade her to marry me.
So part 3 moves to I see you in your strengths, and one of the recurring constructs that you use throughout the book is this notion of illuminators versus diminishers, and which seems to be especially pertinent in part 3, I see you in your strengths. So talk to us a bit about that.
Yeah, so diminishers are people who are not curious about you. They don't make you feel seen. They make you feel invisible. They're just like they stereotype, they ignore. We all know people like that. And then illuminators are people who are curious about you. They ask you about you. They make you feel respected and lit up. And so an example of an illuminator is there's a novelist named Ian Foster who wrote in England in the 120 years ago. And his biographer wrote of him was to be with him is to be, quote, seduced by an inverse charisma, a sense of being listened to with such intensity, you had to be your sharpest, most honest, best self. We'd all love to listen with that kind of intensity.
Yeah.
Another example is that Bell Labs is this famous research facility, and the patent lawyers there noticed that some of the researchers were more creative and more innovative than others. And they wanted to know, why are these people so much more productive than the others? And they looked at their educational background, their IQ, they couldn't figure it out. And they finally realized that those productive researchers were in the habit of having breakfast or lunch with an electrical engineer named Harry Nyquist. And Harry Nyquist would get inside their head, would think through their problems with them, and help them come up with solutions. So Harry Nyquist was an illuminator. He had the ability to get inside another person's head. And that's what we're trying to be, the kind of people who are curious about others, perceptive about others, able to get in other people's heads.
So I can't remember if you quote Alistair McIntyre or not. I think you do, but McIntyre has that famous line about we can't kind of know what we're supposed to do with our lives until we know of what story or stories we find ourselves a part. And you at least point to this notion that one of the things that we can do for other people is ask questions in such a way so that it gives them an opportunity to experiment with telling their own story. How'd you come to see that?
Yeah, during the research for the book, I interviewed a few times a guy named Dan McAdams, who teaches at Northwestern. And he studies how do people tell their life story. And so he pulls people in his research lab And he says, tell me your high points, tell me your low points, tell me your turning points. And he says, yeah, the interviews take 4 hours or so. He says about half the people cry because something sad has happened to them. And then after the 4 hours, he hands them a little check to pay them for their time. And a lot of the people push back the check across the desk and say, I'm not taking money for this. No one has ever asked me my life story before. This has been one of the best afternoons of my life. And people, often nobody's ever asked them. And so if you can ask people about their life story, you're giving them immense pleasure. You're giving them a chance to tell their story, which is a way to create their story. And you're learning a lot about them. So for example, when I'm listening to a life story, first thing I want to know is what's the narrative tone here? Every writer has an implied author, the person the writer wants you to think he is. And so some people have a sarcastic tone. Some have a pompous tone. Some have a knowing tone. So you learn a lot about a person. What's the tone here? The second thing I'm looking for when somebody's telling me their life story is, who's the hero here? Some people, their persona is, I'm the healer. I'm the person who comes into a family and I heal things. In some people, it's I'm the fighter. So I read Viola Davis's memoir, the actress, and her persona is I'm like the fighter. The society is out to get me, frankly, because I'm poor and I'm Black. And I'm a fighter. I'm fighting back. I'm going to establish myself in the world. So that's her persona. In my persona, I'm the learner. I go through life. I'm just trying to learn. And then the third thing I'm looking for is what's the plot here? And so all of us tell our story according to a certain plot. And some people, the plot is rags to riches. I was a poor boy. I made it. That's my plot. Some people, it's overcoming the monster. I had an abusive parent, but I overcame it. Or I struggled with alcohol. I overcame it. I'm overcoming the monster. My story, and I think for a lot of Americans in particular, it's a redemption story. I was going along fine. I suffered a big setback. I came back stronger. That's redemption. And this guy, Dan McAdams, wrote a book called The Redemptive Self. And he argued in it, most people tell redemption stories about themselves, about how they had a setback and they came back better. And he's on a lecture tour talking about this book, and he goes around the world. And the audiences around the world were like looking at him with like quizzical expressions. They're like, no, that's the story Americans tell. You guys tell redemption stories. We don't tell that. We have different stories. And so I think every culture has a different set of stories people use to tell the narration of their own lives. But if you don't have a story to tell, you can't know what to do. This is what Alistair McIntyre said. He said, you can't know what to do unless you know what story you're a part of. And if you know what your overall story is, then you can make the big decisions of life. And the novelist Isaac Dinesen said, all sorrows can be endured if they can put into a story. So if you're a Marine and you're at boot camp and you're struggling, it's almost unbearable. But if you can say, this is a moment in my life, I'm going to come out of boot camp, I'm going to be a Marine, that's the story of my life. Then the pains of being in boot camp at Paris Island or whatever, they're endurable because they're part of a larger story.
When you lean into wanting to hear somebody's story, do you just ask them, or what kind of practical ways you make space for that?
Yeah, it's not hard. Like, who were you as a kid? You can do what Dan McAdams says, give me your high points, your low points, your turning points. There are other ways to do it. Give me your strengths. Give me your sparks, the things you're interested in. Give me your struggles. But the simplest way is like, who were you as a kid? When did you change? What have been the hard points in your life? What have been the great points of your life? I was a foreign correspondent for the Wall Street Journal, and it's 1991. I'm in Russia, and Boris Yeltsin is elected Democratic president of Russia, the first Democratic president of Russia. And the old communists, who are still sort of in power, stage a coup. And so the tanks are rolling through Russia, and they're going to try to destroy the first democratically elected president, and they're going to kill Yeltsin. And he stands on a tank in front of the Russian Parliament building, which is called their White House. And I run into a woman who's like in her 90s, and her name was Valentina Kosieva. And she's handing out sandwiches to the democratic protesters who've gathered to preserve democracy in Russia. And so I asked her, how'd you get into this? What's your interest here? And she said, well, let me tell you, when I was a girl, my family was in the royal family in the household of the Tsar. And then when the revolution happened, the royal family was killed, and I fled, and I was part of the Russian Revolution. There was a civil war right after the revolution, and I was almost executed because I harbored some of the people who were anti-communists in those days. And then I said, so then what happened? And she said, well, I had a husband in the 30s, and Stalin sent him away to the Gulag and had him killed. And so then I said, well, then what happened? And she said, well, we had 2 boys, and they were fighting against the Nazis in World War II, and my youngest son was beaten to death in the Battle of Stalingrad, and my other son was shot. And so I said, well, then what happened? And she said, well, I married another guy, and in the 1950s, he was also sent to the Gulag in Siberia, and he vanished. I never saw him again. And so I said, well, then what happened? And she said, well, I'm part of the Kalmyk people, which is a Muslim population in the Soviet Union. And Khrushchev decided we were all going to be sent to internal exile. So we were all ripped from our apartments, and we were sent to internal exile somewhere in Russia. And so all I did was say over and over again, and then what happened? And basically every terrible thing that had happened in Soviet history happened to her. And when she's 90, she's handing out sandwiches for the democratic protesters to try to end the Soviet Union and create a better Russia. And so it was one of the most remarkable interviews I ever had. And to get her life story, all I had to do was say, and then what happened? And then what happened? And then what happened? And it was a remarkable few hours that she described to me her whole life.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's amazing. You have another very practical suggestion, especially when we're talking about having conversation with people with whom we may have differing convictions or opinions. And you suggest that rather than asking, what do you think about X, you ask them, how did you come to believe X? That's a highly practical and helpful approach, I think.
Yeah, I've learned to get people into narrative mode, get them telling me a story. Don't tell me your beliefs. Don't give me an argument. Just tell me your story. And so, for example, I'm not a big pro-Trump guy, but I have a lot of friends who are pro-Trump people. And so I ran into a guy in South Dakota who was very enthusiastic about Donald Trump. And I said, how do you come to be that enthusiastic? And he was 70, and he said, let me tell you about the best day of my life. I'm 35. I was a foreman at a part of a plant, and we made refrigeration equipment. And they replaced the equipment at the plant. I was no longer qualified to be a foreman at that section. And so he said, so they laid me off. And I thought I'd gather up my stuff, and I'd just leave and make it quiet. I wouldn't make a big fuss. And so he says, I went to my office, I put my stuff in a box, I opened the office door, and there in my office door was a double row of people, 3,600 people, everybody who worked in the plant. And they formed a double row between my office door, through the plant, and out to the parking lot to my car door in the parking lot. And so I left carrying my box, and they applauded me the whole way because they appreciated the work I'd done for the company. And he said, that was the best day of my life. And that was 35 years ago. And every job I've ever had ever since was lower paying, more insecurity, worse. My wife and I spend all our days trying to look after my mother-in-law who's struggling in old age. And so my life has gone downhill, gone downhill for 35 years. And you may not like Donald Trump, but I need a change. And he's my ticket to change. And so I may not end up agreeing with that guy, but he's told me a story, and it's like, okay, I get where you're coming from. And so that's how politics should be handled. I'm not going to agree with you, but I get where you're coming from.
Yeah. You do say a couple of times things like, I've absorbed my share of the blows that any adult suffers, broken relationships, public failures, the vulnerability that comes with getting older. What would be some of those that you could feel comfortable talking about in a context like this?
Well, some I've talked about in public. I've gone through a divorce. That was hard. I've gone through public failures. I mean, even a little silly one was like happened to me 3 or 4 months ago. I'm traveling, and I'm at Newark Airport, and I have a meal, and it's probably the most unhealthy meal I hope I've had in the last 6 months. It's like burger, fries, and bourbon. And the check comes, and it's like $78. And so I take a picture of it, and I think about this for like 3 seconds, and I send out a tweet, and my joke it's like, I can't even afford to make poor lifestyle choices to have like a bunch of fries and bourbon at a airport hotel, a restaurant. But I think I wrote it very stupidly. And it's just like, this is why Americans hate inflation, because it's $78 for a meal like this. And of course, when people see me writing that, they don't think, oh, here's a poor guy struggling through life. They think, here's an affluent New York Times columnist. What a jerk. He's complaining about a $78 dinner, but he makes enough money to afford it. So what a jerk that guy is. And that's a fair reaction. I was a total idiot to write that tweet. It was just stupid, and it was insensitive. And so it goes viral. And like, I read articles and books, and I hope I reach a large audience. But that one stupid tweet went viral, and it was seen 39 million times. And so, like, I'm a total idiot before 39 million people. And so there are times like this where you just endure, like, okay, I've made a jerk out of myself. I've done something incredibly stupid. I feel humiliated, but I'm going to live with it because I deserve it. So we all, I happen to have a role that's kind of public, but we all go through moments where we feel embarrassed by by the stupid stuff we've done. And so I'm like anybody else. I've gone through a lot of those moments. Every 8 years, I make a total jerk out of myself.
How have you learned to navigate dealing with the high level of hostile responses that you get due to your work?
I guess I got this job at the Times in 2003, and I'm more conservative than Times readers are in general, significantly more conservative, especially back then. And so in those days, in 2003, we were in the naive days of the internet era. And so the Times put our email addresses at the bottom of every column. And so after my first 6 months on the job, I cleaned out my email inbox, and there were 290,000 emails. And most of them were you're a right winger, you're evil. Like, that was the core message. And I thought I should read all the responses because it's a responsible thing to do, to figure out what people think. I got so depressed reading them all. So I made my assistant read them all, and he got depressed. And so there's some level of, you just have to, establish some distance so that every psychopath does not have an easy access into your own insecurities in your own heart. And so I established some distance. So now I have a thicker skin. I read the comments under my column, but it's with a thicker skin, and I don't take it as personally. But the people who are really mean, they're not just mean, they're effectively mean. They know exactly what's going to hurt you. And then once their little thought gets into your head, it's hard to get it out.
Yeah.
So I have to protect my heart in these circumstances.
Yeah. So what's the next, what kind of things do you anticipate celebrating or working on the next 5 years, 10 years of your vocation?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I have a general topic for my next book, which is about the idea of merit. So we've created a society where we sort people based on how they do in IQ tests, like SAT tests, or whether they're good at pleasing teachers between the ages of 15 and 23. And this strikes me as an insane way to sort people. And so we should have a different version of merit. And so I think a lot of the college admissions methods should be gone. A lot of the way we hire people will be gone. And we should have an idea of merit that's not based on pleasing teachers between 18 and 25. And plus, we have the artificial intelligence revolution coming down the track. And that's going to totally redefine our definition of intelligence. Mm-hmm. Because machines will do a lot of the things that we consider intelligence. And so it's going to be up to find what can we humans do that the machines will never do? And a lot of that is social skills, a lot of it is empathy, a lot of that is understanding. And so I think we're on the cusp of redefining what merit means in our society.
Yeah.
Because our current definition takes the smartest, richest group of people, gives them an easy pathway into Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and shuts everybody else out. It's just ridiculous.
Yeah. Huh. You said a moment ago that you are perhaps not as conservative as you were when you started the Times in 2003. What would you say are some of the key ways in which you can see development or change in that regard?
I think when I was coming up as a young man, I thought the major problem in America, as in Britain, was we were stagnating. We need to be great nations. And so we needed leaders who would create a lot of economic dynamism. And I think Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan really did that. I think they really got rid of a lot of regulations that were holding us back. They created a capitalism that was more dynamic and more creative and more wealth generating. And I think that was the right response for the 1980s. But the 1980s were a long time ago now. And to me, the major problem now is that we're leaving a lot of people behind. That people in rural America, that parts of people in urban America, parts of people in the Midwest, we're just leaving them behind. And so the role of government now to distribute some money to people who have been left behind because of education, because of geography. And so I'm a lot more friendly to government that does the infrastructure bill that Joe Biden did, that did the CHIPS Act, which invests in high technology plants in Iowa, in Illinois, in Michigan. And so, it's not that I've changed particularly, but the problems have changed. And so I hope I've adapted to the problems of the times. And so before I really admired Reagan and Thatcher. And now I think Joe Biden's done a pretty good job of funneling money to people who without college degrees. And that's what we need right now. And so that makes me seem a little more, I guess I'm sort of moderate than I was more Reagan and Thatcher. But I think what we need now is what, the kind of bills like the Infrastructure Act, the CHIPS Act, they funnel money to people who've been left behind. That's what we need to do.
And then with regard to your development spiritually, religiously, what kind of things, experiences, circumstances contributed to change in that regard?
Yeah. So I grew up in a Jewish home, but I went to a church school and a church camp. And so I had two stories in my head. One was the Exodus story that Jews tell on the Seder night at Passover. And then I also had the Jesus story in my head. I was in the choir at a church school. And because it was New York City, the choir was like 30 or 40% Jewish. And so we'd sing the hymns, but we wouldn't sing the word Jesus to square with our religion. So the volume in the church would sort of drop down as we didn't sing the word Jesus. But I had the Jesus story in my head. And it didn't matter to me through most of my life because I was an atheist. I didn't believe in God. So these were just two stories.
Huh.
And then when I hit around 50, I thought, the world is not just atoms. It's not just a bunch of molecules. There's some force of love in the world. And I had some experiences in New York where I thought, the people in the subway car around me, they all have souls. They have souls of infinite value and dignity. They have souls that are yearning, souls that are sick. And once you have the idea that people have souls, there must be a God who gave them souls. There must be something beyond the material world. And so I went on a spiritual journey, especially around 2013, 2014, some of the hardest period of my life. And I learned that when you go on a spiritual journey in America, people give you books. They want to help you along. And so over a couple months, I got about 600 or 700 books given to me.
Oh, my.
Only 300 of which were different copies of Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. And so I went on a journey of spiritual discovery. And I found the Jesus story is how I understood the love that I experienced in the world.
Huh.
That the Beatitudes, the idea that the last shall be first, the meek shall inherit the earth, that the beatitudinal wisdom was to me, the ultimate miracle. That this guy in first century Israel but adapted historically Jewish teaching to give you a sense of the great inversions of the Christian faith. That strikes me as just something of supreme and divine beauty. And I can never not unread that. And so that had a big journey, a big transformation for me. And I've been on a journey. It's been this stumbling journey like so many of us ever since. And I joke that me becoming a Christian in 2013 was like investing in the stock market in 1929. It was not the best timing in the world, but there it is. And so I've been struggling and sort of stumbling forward ever since.
So last question. How do you posture yourself, or how do you steel yourself for the upcoming season of politics that clearly looks like it's going to be a lot of contention?
Yeah, I'm not ready for it. So I've lived through the last 7 years, as we all have. And even the last few months after October 7th in Israel, it's just been a brutal period. Mm-hmm. And so my only resolution to myself, and I don't know if I'll succeed in this, is I'm not going to get calloused over. Like we're going to have a tough political fights. We're going to have a lot of insults, a lot of canceling. And I'm just not going to be turned into a warrior. I'm going to lead with curiosity. I've found in life, if you lead with trust and trust other people, sometimes you'll get betrayed. But sometimes the people you trust will trust you back. And so I think it's not unrealistic. It's not naive to lead with trust, to lead with curiosity, to lead with respect. And you may get bullied and beaten up occasionally, but it's better to be a defiant humanist than not. And so I'm in a hotel bar a couple of weeks ago, and I'm looking through Twitter, and I'm looking through all the violent images in the Middle East. And I come across a video that randomly pops up on my Twitter feed. And it's of James Baldwin, the great black writer. And he's giving an interview sometime in the 1960s. And he says, the world is held together by the love of very few people. There may not be as much humanity as one would like, but there's enough. There's enough humanity in the world. And you have to remember, when you walk down the street, every person you look at, that could be you. You could be that person. And so to me, when I saw that, like James Baldwin, he had to face a lot of racism in the 60s and 50s and 70s. And yet he refused to be calloused over. He was going to be a defiant humanist. And I decided I'm going to try to walk through this season that way. I'm going to try to remain open, vulnerable, and trusting. Yeah. And I may get betrayed, but I'm not, at least I won't be calloused over by the hard times we're in the middle of.
Been talking to David Brooks, op-ed columnist for the New York Times, on his latest book, How to Know a Person, The Art of Seeing Others Deeply and Being Deeply Seen. Thank you, David. It's been great to be with you today.
Oh, it's great to be with you again, Lee. It's been always a pleasure to be with you.
Indeed. Thank you. Hey there, quick favor. We're conducting an audience survey. We would be really grateful if you could take just a few minutes and answer our survey. Please visit survey.prx.org/no-small-endeavor. That's survey.prx.org/no-small-endeavor. Would love it if you'd go take that survey today. Thanks. If you or someone you know is in crisis, you can contact the Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 1-800-273-8255. Our thanks to all the stellar team that makes this show possible. Christy Bragg, Jacob Lewis, Sophie Byard, Tom Anderson, Kate Hayes, Mary Evelyn Brown, Carriot Harmon, Jason Sheasley, Ellis Osborne, and Tim Lauer. Thanks for listening, and let's keep exploring what it means to live a good life together. No Small Endeavor is a production of PRX, Tokens Media LLC, and
Great Feeling Studio.